suffered under Magufuli, because we were not, I mean, you know, generally, the general public and people like me were not the only people who suffered under Magufuli. There were CCM's diehards who were victimized under Magufuli too, who did not dare speak, who suffered in silence under Magufuli. And so there is a realization within CCM, I think, that presidential powers have to be curtailed constitutionally, because presently they are far too large, and you know, you need a president with a certain amount of largesse and kindness to have these huge powers. Without that, you do end up with a dictatorial, instead of a benevolent dictator, because this is what the Katiba, our constitution, has set up the president to be, a dictator. So we have to look at the character of the president. If the president is a kind person, then we will end up with a benevolent dictator. If the president is a horrible man, evil to the core, we will end up with an evil dictator. And we ended up with an evil dictator during Magufuli's time. Now, they're quite aware, I think, that they don't want this to happen again, because you cannot know someone's personality. So there is a but. We may get, after all, some assistance from CCM, but the problem with CCM is this: it's the question of how many governments should we have? Should we have the two-tier structure as we presently have it, which is what they want, or should we have a three-tier structure, or should we have a union, which is a union, a treaty union only? And CCM want the two-tier structure. They're concerned. They're concerned if they open up this process, people want a three-tier structure. That's their worry.
Thank you, Fatma. Thank you, Fatma. We are concerned about time. We are very short.
Apologies.
A very small window in which we can operate. Let me go to Professor Kitila Mkumbo, without necessarily wanting you to be a spokesperson for the ruling party. You have been associated with that party because you have served in its government. And Fatma is saying that there is very little goodwill on the part of CCM to see thoroughgoing constitutional reforms taking place in Tanzania, because you are bent on holding on to power at whatever cost. Do you think something has changed in the meantime, that something has evolved, that we can now credit Samia Suluhu Hassan with goodwill that is enough to move the process ahead? Do you see that kind of willingness on her part and on your part within CCM?
I think, thank you very much, Janare, for having me in this platform and in this conversation. I think is a very important one. Number one, we have to, in my view, we have to note that the power of the president, as it is enshrined in our constitution, is also very much reflected, and I think is also drawn from the power of the chair of CCM. So the power of the president that you see in our constitution, they very much equal with the powers of the CCM chair. So, I mean, it has been decided within CCM and from the president, who is the chair of the party, down the line, that yes, we decided ourselves in 2014 that we have to go for the constitution, and I think we need to resume to that. The second point is that we needed to remind ourselves that a lot of things in this country, from the historical point of view, that have happened, they happened because of the goodwill of the president of the day. Most of the big struggles we have had were not really a product of the struggle. They were a product, there were struggles here and there, but at the end of the day, it required the goodwill of the head of state of the day. We know how we got into the multipartism Yes, the opposition had spoken out, a couple of civil society organizations, but at the end of the day, it took Mwalimu Nyerere and finally CCM to embrace multi-party system because of the circumstances of the day. It took, as Fatuma said correctly, it took, I don't know if it is the kindness of Jakaya Kikwete or the goodwill, but it took the presidency of Jakaya Mrisho Kikwete to kickstart the process of the Constitution in 2014. It took the presidency of Magufuli to stop it altogether. It has now taken again the president of Haki, Samia Suluhu Hassan, to kickstart. And I can see that it is starting because I have seen, for example, if you read this year's budget recommendations of the Minister of Constitutional Affairs, I think their priority number one is to coordinate the process of the constitutional review process. So it is going to happen, it seems to be. So I'm going to say that so long as the president and the chair of CCM is into this process, I have not seen an iota of evidence within CCM. I've not seen an iota of evidence of any resistance, some sort of. I've not come across anybody in CCM saying that this one we're not going to start. So we have a tradition in this party of rallying behind the chair of the party. And I can assure you, as far as I'm concerned, from the people that I've interacted with, from the conversation that I hear, from what I read, I think the whole party is behind Samia Suluhu Hassan on this question. So the process is going to go as that such. And finally, we have to remind ourselves, as much as the content or the agenda of whatever change that we may be pushing in this country, the content, the agenda, mostly has always been initially determined by the opposition. But the process has always been managed and controlled by CCM. So yes, the opposition has been pushing for resumption of the constitution review process, but actually finally, given the current political circumstances, it is the system that is going to determine the process and eventually the content. Now, the shape that is going to take will depend really, because we are stuck. I think the current constitutional process was stuck partly or largely because of the lack of consensus from the various political spheres. We hope this time around, because now the system and the main opposition seems to be working together. We want to believe that this time we might go to the end. Thank you, General, for the time being.
Thank you, Prof. I noticed somebody I hadn't announced, Florence Nakazibwe from DC. Are you with us?
Yes, I am, Generali. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, welcome.
Thank you.
This discussion. We have had Fatma Karume, we have had now Professor Kitila Mkumbo, and I don't know whether, Fatma, you want to have a rejoinder there? You have a minute or so?
Yes, I mean, you know, I think I'm thrilled that the good professor recognizes the fact that we do have a very centralized system of power, and the centralized system is presidential, and it's based on CCM's view of the chairmanship of their party. So I'm pleased that he recognizes that, and it is precisely this centralization of power that has been concerning me for a very, very long time. I mean, whether we have the other issues are sort of peripheral as far as I'm concerned, but this huge concentration of power in the hands of one person is of great concern to me. And that is why I would like to see a new constitution.
Okay, being concerned about the concentration, too much concentration of power in the hands of one person is a genuine concern, I think.
Yeah.
But I also think that what we should concern ourselves with right now is whether this process could be relaunched successfully. Do you believe in what Mkumbo is saying, that he sees no resistance, no objection within CCM to what Samia is proposing to do?
I think they may not be, but I don't trust CCM. This is the problem. You know, that they sorry to say this, but they hijack things and then they camouflage. It's just a party that seems to think lies and camouflage and you know, it's a very odd party. I don't understand how it operates. So I find I don't trust CCM as a whole, and really I would believe it when I see it.
Okay, thank you very much. As they say, seeing is believing. We'll leave it at that for the time being. For the moment, we will go over to Nairobi and listen to Jill Cottrell Guy, who is going to share with us the experience in Nairobi, because they delivered in 2010, they delivered a fantastic constitution that was hailed as one of the brightest moments in Kenya's history and on the African continent as well. Now, I would like to ask Jill to share with us what really happened on the level of civil society and their contribution, which we know was stellar by many people's judgments. And yet we see there are hitches, there are hiccups still taking place around this constitutional arrangement that you decided on in 2010, as was witnessed even yesterday. What is the role of civil society in the past? And what role can civil society play even today to reconcile the seemingly reconcilable positions between President Ruto and Raila Odinga and Uhuru Kenyatta? Jill, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Generali, and thank you very much for having me. And should I say that sitting beside me is Yashpal Ghai, who is one of the architects of the Kenya Constitution. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much, everybody. First question I was asked was about what are the key drivers that informed the constitution-making process, and why was the process successful? My first note was that there was a very important factor, to my mind, was the desire to get rid of President Moi. Now, Yash slightly demurred to that when he saw my notes, and I should say, this, of course, for one thing, the process went on well after Moi had ceased to be president, so that, because it was not by any means the only factor, although I do believe that it was an important factor at the early stages, and indeed not just Moi as an individual, but what he stood for: ethnic politics, lack of the rule of law, autocracy. In fact, talking about all-powerful presidents, in the 1990s and the early 2000s, Mwai Kibaki, who was himself to become president by the end of 2002, was very fond of talking about the imperial presidency. So definitely there was a sense that not only did people want to get rid of Moi, but that the experience of the previous 20 years or so, eventually 24 by the time he left office, indicated that there was necessity not to have a constitution that did not have an imperial presidency, rather like the situation in Tanzania at the present moment. So what was the role of civil society in this process? Let me say that we were not actually in Kenya during the 1990s. And I'm very much indebted to an excellent book written by former Chief Justice Mutunga called Constitution Making from the Middle. And by from the middle, he means that a lot of the initiative came from the middle classes. And the middle classes organized into various movements and bodies and so on, including the Law Society of Kenya, of course. although he insists that the issues became something of a much wider interest than just the middle classes and in much wider involvement than just the middle classes. But in that early stage, there they were organizing for a new constitution in opposition to the government. Rather, as Fatima was saying, the movement for a new constitution in Tanzania was one of the opposition. Of course, before the early 1990s, a formal opposition was not possible because we had a legal one-party state until 1991. And the abolition of that was what made it possible to organize and have clearly political organizations that were not just KANU. But Moi, definitely his position was in the early stages, we do not need a new constitution. In fact, this is very often the case. Politicians would often prefer no new constitution, at least especially when they're in power under the new constitution. So what's wrong with it? Or within reach of power. When they can see, they think they're going to get power under the existing constitution. So again, what's wrong with the existing constitution? The civil society kept up the pressure in a remarkably sustained fashion through the 1990s. And there was a very wide range of types of civil society organization, including, one has to give credit where it's due to the faith-based organizations. The various types of Christian churches, the Muslims, the Hindus. There was a great deal of involvement from the faith section in this whole process. There was, I think, a downside to the get rid of Moi aspect of the whole movement, because for some people this was more important than a new constitution, which meant that there was a sort of tendency perhaps to say, well, if we got rid of Moi, in fact, there was a slogan in 2002, everything is possible without Moi. As Mutunga comments, that sometimes there wasn't enough consideration of what would happen after Moi, which is why one really needed a new constitution. And then when an official process was set up, and Yashkai was the chair of that process, there was some resistance. Because for people who had been very actively, deeply engaged in the people's process, the civil society process, and now they assumed, and it was not an irrational assumption, that this was just another ploy by Moi not to get a new constitution. But something that helped was the fact that there had been a People's Commission set up through the faith-based section of society. And this, after the official appointment, merged with the official body. And this is as a result of Yash's insistence. He refused to be sworn in until the two bodies were actually, a new body was constituted that involved people from both. A process that took some months, but had a lot of publicity to it and really attracted people's attention. Other threats to a successful process, there were many, and you need to know about the threats before you realize how successful a process is if it continues. The greed of some people who wanted to use the occasion just to make money. They would drag it on for the sake of allowances and status and perks like cars and so on. And of course, the longer the thing went on, then one feared that there might be a loss of enthusiasm on the part of the people. Then, of course, there were the positive efforts of government. Some members of Yash's commission were reporting to Moi, later on, I think, to Kibaki. Efforts were made to bribe Yash to slow down or even subvert the process. And then because the MPs, when they got to the stage of having a draft constitution at the National Constitutional Conference, which began eventually in 2003, the latter had to adjourn because all the MPs were members. And sometimes it seemed that there was a deliberate effort to adjourn more often than necessary just to slow the process down. And it is arguable that yeah, people did sometimes think things were slow. The media tended to focus on when rather than what in a new constitution. And once Moi had gone, as I say, some people felt, well, you know, since the steam was going out of the process. But maybe if it had not been for the post-election violence of 2007 to 8, we would still have had that old constitution. Let me say a little bit more in response to a second question, the specific role of civil society in influencing the reform process. Because in the 1990s, the civil society was the main source of pressure. It was very well organized on the whole, I think. They produced a draft constitution, so they concretized the situation, showing what the ideas, some of the ideas would look like if you put them in a constitution. Various organizations came into existence. Some of them lasted longer than others. But the main one held 3 meetings of a movement towards a constitutional convention, which is the mode that was being advocated. And eventually, Moi, having used various ruses, was compelled to give in and set up an official local process. At one point, he had said, I'll bring in experts, foreign experts, they can do the constitution, but eventually he set up the official local process. So these were some of the threats, and they were overcome, not always easily, but it's striking that they were, because Msungu wrote his book in 1997, so he was sort of giving up on the struggle, which there'd just been a general election, and people felt that, again, Moi had they'd been cheated of a fair election. But in fact, civil society and the faith-based sector and so on did not give up. It was only a year or so later that a new Constitution of Kenya Review Commission Act was passed, and things actually got moving. But then I wanted to point out, politicians can be very successful in subverting the process, and Fatma has pointed out how that happened in Tanzania. And in Kenya, it was Moi in the 1990s. Kibaki took over the draft that was produced by the National Constitutional Conference in 2004 to 5, and changed it in some radical respects, and it was rejected, as you will know, in a referendum in 2000. And then, when we had a new process that started after the post-election violence, and they produced a draft which went to the public for comment, and then they produced a revised draft, and then their revised draft went to a parliamentary committee. The parliamentary committee seized hold of it and made some radical and not very satisfactory changes. Some of them, I won't say disastrous, but the system of government we have now, which is much more of a presidential system, although it was supposedly with some safeguards that didn't exist under the old constitution. Basically, that was the work of that parliamentary committee, and the ambitions of certain individuals, I'm sure, were involved in that process. And the committee of experts, which was the final stage of the constitution making process, did not feel able to challenge some of the recommendations that that committee, that parliamentary committee made, for fear that they lost, the whole thing, and the baby was thrown out with the bathwater, if you like. There is what is, and the final question I was asked is, have the reforms been sustained in terms of enforcement? And I have to say the picture is very mixed. The things that work best, and I think this is a lesson for constitution makers, is those that tend to set up an institution which has to be worked in a certain way, otherwise it's unconstitutional. So Parliament has to be structured in a certain way, and that sort of thing. And this sort of thing it's not automatic, but because the politicians want to be able to do what they want to be able to do, they need to operate in accordance to some extent with the rules. And then, of course, the other things that will work, I think, better are those things in which the public is committed and determined to insist on their rights, and so on. On the gender front, there's been a good deal of improvement, but of course, as people will be aware, we still have not managed to have no more than 2/3 of either gender in Parliament, either house. Mutunga interestingly says that one of the things that civil society wanted to achieve in the 1990s was constitutionalism. In other words, a respect for the constitution. It has not been easy. There is a question, I think one has to bear this in mind, of mindset. Politicians get used to doing things a certain way. They get used to the idea that the president has certain powers. And they try as far as possible to go on doing things in the same way, even if it's no longer supposed to be possible under the Constitution. Sometimes they will introduce procedures and institutions which are of dubious constitutional validity in order to enhance particularly patronage, which is so much the way in which our politicians tend to act. And we've been seeing that recently, and I'm sure people have been reading about the slightly strange animal called a chief administrative secretary, with a sort of ancestry in the idea of assistant ministers, somebody who's not either the minister or a cabinet secretary, as we now call them, or a senior civil servant within the public service, really. I'm not quite sure what they're doing there. The Public Service Commission was prevailed upon to agree to this device and recommended 23, and the government has appointed 50. And they've been mostly used to pay off political debts. This is the way things have been always done. It's not supposed to be done, I think, like that, but it's still continuing. Then I'm afraid far too often the government simply ignores court orders, and yet the courts are key to this. We've given courts a very important role in the Constitution, and it's hard to see how one can't do that if one's concerned for the rule of law. So it's far too often, I can't go into detail, but one of them was indeed this business about the chief administrative secretaries. The president rushed to swear them in, although there was an impending court hearing, and which did in fact say they should not be sworn in and take office. And then since apparently that happened, they have actually been turning up the office. So they're ignoring the court orders. And then something that I think has been very unsuccessful is the Constitution makes quite an effort to force political parties to be issue-based. Perhaps more so than Tanzania, our politics have been very ethnic-based, and you won't hopefully have this problem to the same extent as we do. But it's been very hard to move away to any idea of a political party that has an ideology or a serious program. Although there are all sorts of devices in the Constitution that are intended to achieve that. Overall, I still believe that if the people were not committed to the Constitution, things would be much worse. Let me also add something that I haven't said. I talked about the role of civil society in getting a process moving in the 1990s. There was a sort of different situation during the formal processes where, for example, the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission had a mandate to carry out or to ensure that it was carried out, that is civic education. And much of that was done through civil society organizations, but with a guidance from the commission. So they were really working hand in hand all the time with civil society. I think that has been very important. I think the whole process of civil society initiative and civil society involvement has meant that Kenyans are very conscious of the Constitution. They don't necessarily know all the details. And I don't know how many people in any country really know the details of their Constitution. But it's got a sort of commitment to the Constitution. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, 1 minute.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
You can still come back later.
Yeah, fine, that's all right.
because I know Kenya has, actually, I still have a number of questions about what you're saying and what can be done now that there seems to be an impasse in the implementation of the same constitution that was hailed by everybody as being a very important landmark. Now we see it looks like it's beginning to unravel, but we'll come back to that later. I thank you for your contribution, but I would like to go now over to BK. Dr. Businje Kabumba from Kampala, can you walk us through the processes that you went in and what the role of the civil society movement in Uganda was, and how influential it was, what impact it had on the process until you delivered the 1995 constitution that was accepted as a very good document, even if its implementation has been rather problematic. Please, BK.
Okay, thank you very much, Generali, and pleasure to hear from the previous speakers. So in courtrooms, one usually swears to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I'm not too sure where one can locate the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in terms of the story of the 1995 Constitution. Or in fact, even the previous constitutions, and just to go use just a minute into that, Uganda is perhaps unique as one of the creators of precedent for extra constitutional changes of government, starting, of course, from the famous 1966 ex parte Matovu case. So early on, perhaps unlike Kenya and Tanzania, very early on in our political history, we had the experience of constitution making or a constitution being overthrown by force of arms in 1966. And unfortunately, the men with arms have never quite gone away as a feature of our political and legal life. And so it was that in 66, we had a constitution that was basically through the barrel of a gun. The 67 one was really no better because it was a sham consultative process in which those people who were consulted were really a hostage population. From 71 to 79, we had Idi Amin. From 80 to 81, there was a period of uncertainty with rigged elections. And from 81 to 86, we had a Bush war. So that is the background in which then the talk around the 1995 Constitution began to emerge. And again, just from a historical point, the NRM, which came to power in 1986, was really supposed to be a transitional regime. The deal was that they would leave in 1989, so just about 3 years. So what happened then is that in 1988, 1 year towards the end of the transition period, the NRM regime set up the the Constitutional Commission under the leadership of Justice Odoki. And it was envisaged that it would take about a year to complete its work, and so that you'd have 1989, hopefully by 89, a constitution and the change of government. So what happened then is that in 1989, the constitution making exercise was used as an excuse to extend the regime. Basically, the claim was that the constitution making process is so tedious, so involving, that it really deserves much more time than we thought it would, and that really we have to extend. So the unconstitutional extension of the NRM regime was legitimated by the idea of constitution making. That really is the history of the 1995 Constitution. Of course, the entire Constitutional Commission to a person was made up of NRM officials. And so eventually what you have in the 1995 Constitution, so the commission completed this work, provided a draft constitution that was debated by a constituent assembly. The problem was that constituent assembly, the elections to those assembly were conducted in 1 day. Everyone you could only campaign in 1 day, and of course it was supervised by the NRM etc. So in fact, many have argued, including people like Aile Marie Tripp, that you had a sham process leading up to the election of the CA, the Constituent Assembly delegates, who eventually then adopted the 1995 Constitution. Indeed, many have called that constitution the Museveni Constitution, or the NRM NRA constitution. And I think there's some truth to that. Now, the civil society, therefore, in such a scenario, could not really be, and were not, in fact, active players, but they did play a role. And this is, I draw from analysis of Kalundi Serumaga in particular, who has made this claim, which I think is supported by the facts, that in the 1995 Constitution, you have a compromise between the NRM or NRMA, the soldiers who had succeeded in fighting Ofubote, on the one hand, and the elite, or sort of a group of self-interested middle-class Ugandans who wanted jobs. And the 1995 Constitution did create a whole range of jobs, from various statutory bodies to parastatals to a range of district commissions. So there were a number of jobs to be had. And so from 1995 to present, the history of that constitution has been the history of an alliance between the army on the one hand, certain interest groups, including traditional leaders to an extent, definitely, and of course then certain civil society actors who wanted to see certain language in the constitution. And so you really have, as I close, hopefully I'll be able to intervene a bit later, you then have a document that purports to be, like all other constitutions, a document that expresses the will of Ugandans, but that in fact is represents really the will in the first place of Museveni, the NRM, and the army in the very first place, and in the second place, a compromise between that top hierarchy and civil society, or an elite structure who had certain vested self-interest in that constitution, and that therefore it becomes very difficult to then say that that constitution truly reflected the will of the people. I think I'll stop there, but just to say then that was then reflected, has been reflected in the subsequent amendments in 2005 to remove the term limits, and in 2017 to remove the age limits. On both occasions, with some kind again of compromises made to the to civil society and parts of the opposition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Musinje Kabumba. A question, if I may ask here, is there any movement towards a renewal of the constitution-making process? Are there any forces now that are visible in Uganda saying we should re-look at the Constitution of 1995 and see whether there is something that needs to be done to correct it, to correct the errors that we have noticed, and maybe deliver a better governance dispensation?
Yes, there is generally, but unfortunately, I think it's in the tradition of the previous amendments we have seen. So in 2005, you had an amendment that returned the country to a multi-party system, but at the same time, also then removed the term limits and allowed the president to stay on for almost indefinitely. So the first amendment was the self-interested one. The most recent one of 2017 was also involved the similar Faustian bargain, because on the one hand, you had the age limit removed, and so we have the president that can rule until he dies. And on the other, the parliamentarians managed to secure for themselves an extended term from 5 to 7 years. Eventually, the Constitutional Court struck down that particular part of the compromise. So what I see in the coming or the envisaged, because there's now quite a lot of talk about a constitutional amendment or a constitutional review process, but it seems that a lot of that might look very much like the previous amendments, in which you have a clear bargain between contending forces, again arising out of self-interest. And what seems to be a likely scenario is to have a movement towards a sort of parliamentary system on the one hand, and on the other hand to then have some kind of concession to federalism. So the federalism would remove some of the tension away from talk about over-centralization and the president who has stayed in power too long. So that's the bargain on the one hand. And on the other, the parliamentary system will allow an unpopular successor, who might include either the president's son or anyone else, to go through as leader on the basis of a mass party, the NRM, which is backed by the force of the gun and, of course, patronage. And so again, yes, the question review process, but which is deeply cynical, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, anecdotally, maybe you'll have to consider the possibility of including in your constitution the positions of presidents' sons. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, BK. Now we move on to the next segment of this conversation, and I'll go this time to Linda Kasonde, who is from Zambia. Linda, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Yes, Linda Kasonde is chair of the Zambia Bar Association, the first female head of the Zambia Law Society. Congratulations, Linda. And could you help us understand what has been happening in Zambia? I understand that you've had processes in constitution making hampered by delays, misunderstandings, and disruptions. Where are you at now in these processes?
Thank you. I maybe just a correction. I'm a previous president of the Bar Association. I now run an organization called Chapter One Foundation in Zambia. Do I still have the 20 minutes to give my presentation?
I'm sorry, I was served with outdated documents. I'm sorry for that.
That's fine.
But you were the first female chair of the Bar Association, weren't you?
Yes, correct.
Okay, congratulations and continue.
Thank you. Do I still have 20 minutes?
Yes, I think my clock is okay. It's not shouting at me.
Okay, thank you so much. So good afternoon, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen. I'd just like to say from the outset that I'm a human rights lawyer who has an interest in constitutional law. But I was involved in all the processes that I'm about to describe. So I'll start with a quotation from Thomas Paine, who once said, "A constitution is not an act of government, but of a people constituting a government. And a government without a constitution is a power without a right." But what if the people making the constitution don't trust the government, and the government doesn't want its power limited? Since its return to multi-party democracy in 1991, Zambia has been hailed as a beacon of democracy on the African continent. Between 2011 and 2021, Zambia experienced a period of democratic decline, and this narrative came under threat with the rise of populism and increased authoritarianism. Since 1964, an extensive amount of power has been vested in the Republican president, and several attempts at constitutional reform made over the decades since independence have failed to resolve this problem adequately. This has subsequently had negative repercussions for constitutionalism, the separation of powers, and the rule of law in Zambia. So it's been the clarion call of civil society since the reintroduction of multi-party democracy in 1991 for the need for a constitution that addresses these issues and the needs of the Zambian people, what civil society calls a people-driven constitution. Since our independence, we've gone through 5 different constitutional review processes, resulting in 3 completely new constitutions. All of these processes have been driven by competing interests of the ruling parties trying to attain more power against the interests of people seeking constitutional emancipation. Since multi-partyism returned in 1991, we've subsequently had piecemeal amendments to the Constitution by Parliament, led by large ruling majorities, and who determined the final content of the constitutional amendments. For example, approximately 70% of the recommendations made in the 1996 Monacatre Commission recommendations were rejected by the government in the bill that finally went to Parliament. On the 23rd of September 2011, Mr. Michael Chilufya-Sata was elected to the office as the 5th Republican president of Zambia on the Patriotic Front Party ticket. His party had campaigned on the election promise to give the people of Zambia a people-driven constitution in 90 days, no less. President Sata restated his election promise to have the final draft constitution adopted by a national referendum and then enacted through the National Assembly without any changes. On or about 16th November 2011, President Sata appointed the Technical Committee on drafting the Zambian Constitution in response to public demands for a people-driven constitution to review all the recommendations of previous constitutional review commissions and to present a new constitution that would reflect the will and aspirations of the people of Zambia. The Technical Committee, in carrying out its functions, was mandated to submit the draft constitution to the Referendum Commission after incorporating any changes that may have been necessary as a result of the comments from stakeholders and members of the public at large. The Technical Committee solicited views from the public at national, provincial, and district levels. In view of the fact that the final draft constitution included alterations to the Bill of Rights, the Technical Committee drafting the constitution recommended that the whole final draft constitution be adopted through a national referendum. So after the demise of President Sata in 2014, President Edgar Chagwa Lungu ascended to the office of Republican president. And in the events that followed, the government then declared that there would be no referendum for the adoption of the whole final draft constitution, and that the amendment of the constitution would go to the National Assembly. In consequence of this declaration, on 15th October 2015, government tabled before the House of the National Assembly Constitution Amendment Bill number 16 of 2015 and the Constitution of Zambia Amendment Bill number 17 of 2015, respectively. The proposed Constitution of Zambia Amendment Bills sought to replace the entire Constitution with the exception of Part 3, which contains our Bill of Rights. The government sought to amend Part 3 through a national referendum alongside the general elections, and then subsequent enactment through the National Assembly. A coalition of civil society organizations, the church, trade unions, and even opposition political parties came together under the umbrella of what was called the Grand Coalition and campaigned heavily for the draft constitution to be adopted without amendment through the referendum. The Grand Coalition drafted what were called social contracts for all political parties to sign ahead of the 2015 presidential by-election following the death of Michael Sata. And these social contracts allowed the presidential candidates to pledge to adopt the constitution via referendum without change. All major opposition political parties signed the pledge. It was only the ruling party, led by Edgar Lungu, who refused to sign it. But such was the pressure exerted by CSOs when President Lungu won the presidential by-election. The first item in his inauguration speech was that he would enact a new constitution. The referendum to amend the Bill of Rights held alongside the general election failed due to the politicization of the proposed amendments. In January 2016, the ruling Patriotic Front government enacted the constitutional amendments through Parliament. Whereas the final draft constitution prepared by the Technical Committee had 320 articles, the final amendments only contained 285 articles. Even taking into account the removal of the provisions of the Bill of Rights, this was a clear indication that a lot of provisions preferred by the people of Zambia, as submitted to the Technical Committee, had been discarded by the government, and no justifiable reason had been given to the public for this omission. So at the time, I was vice president of the Law Association, and during that time, the Law Association of Zambia opposed the bill being passed through the National Assembly without first being adopted by the Zambian people for two reasons. Firstly, we argued that radical amendment of the Constitution should not be done through Parliament without being adopted by the people of Zambia. The preamble of the Constitution, as read with Article 1 of the Constitution, makes the people of Zambia the ultimate determiners of how they should be governed, and therefore any extensive changes to the Constitution, as were proposed by the Constitution Amendment Bill of 2015, which had the effect of altering the character of the Constitution, mandatorily required that the people of Zambia adopt the contents before such changes could be made. We believed that the national referendum was the most adequate, inclusive, legitimate, and democratic means of making such consultations. Ground two was that we argued the decision to take the bills through Parliament was not fair and reasonable in light of historical facts. The government's decision to table the bills in issue before the National Assembly well, essentially, as I mentioned earlier, the various constitutional processes since independence in 1964 had cost colossal sums of money, only to be wasted on creating constitutional reform more favorable to the government than to the people. So, in spite of civil society's best efforts, the Constitution Amendment Bills number 1 and 2 of 2016 were passed. However, it turned out to be a blessing in disguise, as it appeared that amidst the pressure on governments to pass a people-driven constitution, the government had left clauses in the bill that limited their powers and became a source of political frustration to them. For example, there was a new requirement that all members of parliament had to possess a Form 5 certificate. This disqualified many people from holding office. Another example was the fact that whilst government had removed the clause on the appointment of ministers from outside parliament, the government had labored under the misapprehension that that gave them the authority to remain in office after the dissolution of parliament ahead of the August 2016 general elections. This attempt was successfully challenged by the Law Association of Zambia in the Constitutional Court, and the ministers were made to pay back all the emoluments that they had been paid during the time that they legally remained in office. I think that you can say that overall, the people had the majority of what they wanted included in the 2016 amendments. So to a large extent, the campaign by CSOs was successful. I think that is because the CSOs had built up momentum and created what Zambian Professor Munandulo calls constitutional moment. In other words, the time was ripe for the constitutional process to go ahead. In terms of the Tanzanian situation, I believe that Tanzania must create this moment by building consensus among people and exerting pressure on the government. So the Patriotic Front were re-elected in 2016, and by 2019, they already began to make moves to make substantial amendments to the Constitution in a bid to entrench their hold on power. This followed political tension in the country that had arisen following the contested victory by the Patriotic Front government in the August 2016 general elections. The leading opposition political party, the United Party for National Development, or UPND, took out a presidential petition which was thrown out on a technicality after the Constitutional Court controversially reversed its decision to allow the UPND lawyers to present their case beyond the initial 14 days provided for. Matters came to a head when UPND leader Hakainde Hichilema was charged with treason for failing to give way to the presidential motorcade. A threatened state of emergency was declared after a fire broke out at the largest market in Lusaka city center. To ease tensions, the Catholic Church and later the Commonwealth Secretariat tried to facilitate talks between the government and opposition political parties. The government rejected all these efforts on the basis that there was need to indigenize the dialogue. This became the pretext under which the government enacted the National Dialogue, Constitution, Electoral Process, Public Order, and Political Parties Act. The stated objectives of the act were: A, to facilitate the implementation of the Siyavonga resolutions of political parties relating to constitutional and institutional reforms, separation of powers, judicial independence, tolerance, freedom of assembly, and civility in politics and electoral reform. B, to provide for national dialogue process to facilitate the constitution refinement process and regulation of political parties, public order, and electoral process reforms. C, to establish a national dialogue forum and provide for its functions. And lastly, D, to provide for matters connected with or incidental to the foregoing. So the National Dialogue Forum was largely constituted of ruling party members of parliament and civil society organizations friendly to the government. The forum was statutorily mandated to deliberate for only 10 days, which was subsequently extended by a few days.
Advocate Linda, I do not know exactly how I can tell you to round up.
Wow.
I really don't know.
I haven't even gotten to, oh gosh.
Maybe you could guide. Because I would like to open up the discussion after we have listened to Advocate Tao. I want to open spaces of all the participants who have lined up, ready to contribute to this conversation. So could you...
Okay, let me, if you can give me maybe 5 minutes, I can wrap up.
Yeah, please see what you can do with 5 minutes.
Okay. So basically, the National Dialogue Forum gave way to the Constitution Amendment Bill of 2019, which in my estimation was the greatest threat to our democracy since 1972, when Zambia was changed from multi-party democracy to a one-party state. And civil society constituted a massive campaign called the Yellow Card Campaign to push back on not only the lawlessness around the lack of rule of law and human rights in the country, but also against the Bill 10, the Constitution Amendment Bill. And my organization and the Law Association of Zambia went to the Constitutional Court to challenge the processes that led to the enactment of the bill. But we were unsuccessful. But that actually created momentum because people became aware of the issues surrounding the bill and its evils. And civil society then took it away, and we had a massive campaign to push back on Bill 10, which ultimately the government fails to pass twice. And this came through the opposition withdrawing from the parliamentary chamber at the time when the vote was tabled. So the government wasn't able to garner the 2/3 majority it needed to pass Bill 10. In conclusion, I believe democracy is meant to promote and protect good governance of the people, by the people, and for the people. And I'm of the view that substantial piecemeal amendments to the Constitution through the National Assembly takes away the opportunity for Zambian citizens to have a people-driven constitution. In my opinion, putting the whole draft constitution through referendum decided by the people is the most legitimate and democratic means of adopting a constitution. In the absence of a clear framework that protects the process and the content of the final constitution from manipulation, the process of debate of the bills in Parliament risks altering the nature and character of what the Zambian people wish to see in the final constitution. And finally, if that happens again, as there is now talk of amending the constitution, once again, it is the people of Zambia who will be the losers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. I just a very small half question almost. Tell me, I'm just curious. Why has Zambia been so versatile in changing governments more than any other country that we know of that it has been recorded, apart from those who carry out military coups over military coups? Why does Zambia look like it's more open to changes of government? Is it because it's a highly urbanized society? Is it because people are so mobile? Is it what really sets out Zambia as different from other constitutional dispensations? And this has been done in a fairly constitutional manner all the time.
So I believe that the fact that our first president, Kenneth Kaunda, stepped down in the 1991 general elections that paved the way for multi-party democracy in Zambia was key in allowing the people of Zambia to see that their power through the ballot box mattered and was consequential. And since then, the memory of that has allowed people to believe that they can change things through the ballot box. That's my own estimation of why, in a nutshell.
Okay, so it means KK set the standards very high, and people would not like to be seen as being contrary to what has been set up as a standard in 1991.
They've certainly tried, but eventually political pressure gets exerted on them, mostly by sometimes former leaders, and then they succumb, such as Rupiah Banda, Edgar Lungu, all were talked to.
Okay, thank you very much, Advocate Linda. Now I go to Advocate Tahal Salyu, all the way in Banjul. We understand that processes like this are not linear in any way, and they tend to suffer twists and turns, highs and lows. And Gambia has not been very different from that kind of description. What have been the major milestones in the process of constitution making in Gambia? And how have you, as members of the bar, alongside other civil society organizations, contributed to finding a certain denouement of the problems that are besetting you on the way to a proper constitutional dispensation decided upon by the people of the Gambia? You're welcome, Advocate Salyu.
Thank you very much for affording me this opportunity to share the Gambian experience. I'll pick up something Linda said, which sort of triggered something in my head. It's outside my script, if I can call it that. When you ask her about the question, why is it Zambians have been able to change their governments successively through the ballot box? And she answered that because KK basically set the tone by stepping down. In the Gambia, Sadauda, who was purportedly one of the greatest democrats in the continent, unfortunately overstayed close to 30 years, and that precipitated the 1994 coup d'etat by Jammeh, who stayed for 22 years until we successfully removed him through the ballot box in a surprise, shocking defeat 2016. He never expected that the Gambian people would actually vote him out, but we did, and we did so peacefully. Now, I mean, that was a major milestone in the history of Gambia. And given that he had a tight reign of power, he had a monopoly of power and violence and resources. but Gambians were able to vote him out despite all his might, purported might. And that sort of gave Gambians a taste of, what democracy can look like. And one of the promises of the coalition that defeated Jammeh was led by President Adama Barrow was the need to change the 1997 constitution, because the 1997 constitution was promulgated under Jammeh when he sort of removed his uniform and put on his civilian clothes, but in a sense remained a dictator, because that constitution was changed and manipulated more than 50 times to basically, arrogate power from the different arms of government to the center, that is to the state. So he really was an imperial president. So I think Gambians recognized the need and demanded for a constitution. And when the new government came in 2016, by 2018, but before that there was a national consultative meeting, which was sponsored by the bar in partnership with the Ministry of Justice and the UNDP to look at the pathway towards democracy. And one of the outcomes of that meeting was the need to have a transitional justice policy program. In 2018, January 2018 precisely, the Constitutional Review Commission was established, given the mandate to review the 1997 Constitution and draft a new one with also a report. The process was very participatory and inclusive from the design stage to start with, in the sense that civil society was very much involved in getting its views, were very much involved in designing the kind of process that we used in bringing forth a new constitution. Even in the appointment of the commissioners, civil society had a say, and the law was written in a manner that ensured that it was inclusive, that there was a representation of Gambians from all different backgrounds, different parts of the country, in different age demography. And all of this, civil society played a very important role. Now, I think one of the greatest milestones for Gambia was the fact that the constitutional building process really took a national dimension in the sense that it was a national conversation of the type of constitution that Gambians want. So the Constitutional Review Commission basically held several consultative meetings across the length and breadth of the country and outside the country with Gambians. And they also involve the local leadership, the local sort of from the village head to the regional, to the mayors and to the chairpersons of local government authorities. And at all levels, they were all involved in discussing and mobilizing people to discuss issues. So they first issued an issues paper of different issues that people can comment on. There was a period of commentary. And there was also a lot of sensitization on radios, particularly in the provinces, community radios, where people were giving their views about different issues. So it really, from living in the dictatorship where people could speak, now people are constantly debating about what type of constitution we should have. Because a lot of people didn't even know we had a constitution, didn't even know what a constitution was. So I think it kind of like they feel a sense of constitutionalism for the first time, and it really got people interested in being part of building the architecture of a democratic country that has been restored from a dictatorship and to a democratic state, which is a process, of course. So this process was a major milestone because it allowed Gambians to agree, at least have a consensus on what type of constitution they want. And a draft was produced from this initial consultation, and that draft was also sent back to the people for comments. And subsequently, there was a final draft, which was sent to Parliament, because under the Gambian Constitution, the bill has to be presented to Parliament and voted first, second, third reading. Unfortunately, it died prematurely at the first reading because of political invested interests, despite the major milestones achieved in terms of increasing, perhaps, a high sense of civic understanding of what the duty of a citizen is and what is expected of a state, and the relation between the state and citizenship. I think this was one of the really major things that really, opened and enlightened Gambians, because we lived in a dictatorship. What a dictatorship does is it actually, sort of brainwashes people into believing that there's this a particular way that you're in a state. Because a lot of young people who were born from '94 never lived through a democracy. They don't understand that. They thought that many perhaps assumed that the powers that were exercised by the president, even sometimes many times very repressive, were normal. So this was normalized. The use of state violence was normalized. And here we're talking about a constitution that says, oh, there's a Bill of Rights in the constitution that gives you the right not to be treated in a particular way. You have socio-economic rights. You have right. If you are detained, you have a right to a lawyer, and so on and so forth. So these are just respecting the dignity of the citizen, basically, which never happened under the dictatorship. So this, I think, empowered the citizens, and for the first time they felt empowered and powerful. That look, we actually employ the president. We can decide who's president or not. We can change president in elections and so on and so forth. So I think that was, in terms of milestone, that was a very, very big one for Gambia. It sort of like shifted the needle from a dictatorship now to a culture of openness, transparency, discourse, and political enlightenment. In terms of the role of the bar and society, the bar obviously was one of the bodies, institutions that submitted an issues paper of what they expect to be in the constitution, and also, I also participated as bar president in several coalitions. A coalition called Coalition CRC 2020, which looked at the whole constitution divided into thematic areas, and each contributed a specialization in one area, and also supported the youth group that had this slogan, "Constitution we want" by the youth, and we did a caravan across the country, speaking across with the young people of the country, asking them, as a young person, what kind of constitution do you want? Does this draft reflect the aspirations of the young people, and what do you think should be in it that will reflect the interests of the young people? So we were pretty active in the building process, not to mention that 5 members of the commission were lawyers, including the chair and the vice chair. Of course, the lesson that we learned as civil society and the bar is that constitution building is a tapestry of political, legal, economic, and social processes. And I think there was a lot of focus on the legal processes. And there's an assumption, that when it goes to Parliament, given that it was a consensus draft, the Parliament would basically not tinker with it really, and would sort of like push it to a level where it goes to a referendum back to the people. Unfortunately, when it went to Parliament, at that point in time, the coalition government had fragmented or broken apart, and the president of the republic and his party had issues with certain aspects of the constitution, mainly typically aspects that sought to reduce the power of the president in the executive power. And also there's a provision that actually had a time limit that actually was subtractive. In effect, meant that the current president at the time, the president at the time, who's also the president now, his fourth time would have counted. So that basically was the breaking point, and obviously we couldn't get the majority in Parliament to to pass it, because under the Gambian constitution, you need a supermajority. You need 75% of the National Assembly members to vote in favor of the constitution. And unfortunately, we only get able to get 31. And as civil society, we did not really work on the National Assembly members. We spent time popularizing the draft in the country, getting the public buy-in, assuming that the politician we elected would act in interest and in accordance with the will of the Gambian people. But of course, that was very naive of us, and that's one of the biggest lessons and takeaway we learned from the process. I think for now, I'll leave it at that, and I welcome any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Advocate Saliu. Thank you very much for that enlightening expose of the situation and the processes that you went through in Gambia. There's an intriguing question, however, and this is like this. You had a military dictator like so many other countries around us, but somehow you had some latitude of organizing elections against that same military dictatorship that killed people who opposed it and acted against its interests. How did you manage that? How did the people of the Gambia manage to organize in such a way that they could resist the military force wielded by Jammeh?
I think it's a confluence of many factors. I think every dictatorship has a tipping point, and after a long time they become complacent and they have this sort of demigod-like belief that they own everyone. So Jammeh said that in 2016 he said that he's not going to campaign and that Gambians who don't vote for him would be ungrateful, because Jammeh brought a lot of infrastructural development in Gambia, more than any Gambian president at the time. So there was a lot of tangible progress under his watch in terms of like physical infrastructure and the like, and so on and so forth. So he assumed that based on that, despite his horrendous human rights, record, he thought that Gambians would vote for him. But at the same time, it was a very repressive regime, and he was indiscriminate in the use of violence. He basically used violence against anyone, including his own tribesmen. Usually, in many African countries, your tribesmen are sort of sacred. You don't touch them. But Jammeh touched everyone, including his tribesmen and women. So it got to a point where I think there was a consensus that having Jammeh remain in power was an existential threat to any Gambian that lives in Gambia, because in the Gambia, during the Jammeh era, no Gambian can guarantee that when they wake up and go to work, they will not end up in jail for no reason, because they'll pick you up for no reason and send you to jail without a court order, or they can pick you up at night and no one will know where you are. And there's nothing anybody could do for you, including lawyers. Lawyers are being locked up. So I think it reached a tipping point. And we also had opposition party leaders who have been really persistent in fighting against Jammeh since the 1997 election onwards. And they came together. The key was they had a coalition government. So people voted against Jammeh because they were just tired of what Jammeh was doing in terms of really his violence. The violence was too much for Gambians to handle, and they just had enough. And they came together as a coalition, which was very good. And for that reason, we were able to vote against Jammeh. Really, to be honest with you, we did not know who Adam Barrow was at the time. The current president, anybody could have won. Anybody who was a flag bearer could have won, because it was simply a vote against dictatorship. It was a vote that we wanted to change our destiny, and we just finally mustered the sort of the wherewithal to say, look, this is enough. And many Gambians, supported the coalition financially, of course, sometimes discreetly and in other ways, to make sure that this Jammeh does not return to power. And just before that, what happened was that there was a youth activist from a youth leader from a major political opposition party who went to protest for electoral reform. And this was around April, I think. And he was arrested and in custody, beaten to death. And when he died, and that caused a national outcry. And when his political party came to protest, the entire leadership of the political party were arrested for unlawful unlawful possession, public order, typical that we have in most of our countries, and also locked up. So at that point in time, Gambians did not have faith in the judiciary, in the judicial system. Gambians knew that Jammeh can use the police to beat you up. He can use his attorney general to prosecute you. He can use his judiciary to lock you up. And then we knew that this is enough. And that was basically the background that really gave us the courage and the commitment. And then we had a platform in Coalition 2016, which was all the political parties basically came together and chose one, and ended up choosing one candidate after the primary, who happens to be Adama Barrow. And then we voted for change. And then when Jammeh decided that after the election, and Gambia, the good thing is we have on-the-spot counting, which somehow Jammeh accepted before. I mean, the previous election, you can count on the spot in every polling station. So we know the results. He couldn't really play with the results. So when he knew he lost the results, he also decided unilaterally to cancel the result. And then that's when we also started a movement called Gambians Decided, where Gambians across the globe, starting from the Gambia and abroad, which I was one of the people who actually pioneered the movement, stood against Jammeh and said, look, we have voted for change and we decided for change, and we're not going to accept anything to change. So it was a peaceful social movement, and that put a lot of pressure.
Thank you, Advocate Salio. And congratulations on your this achievement, because this is great. This man was becoming omnipotent. He was in communication with God, I think. He could cure HIV/AIDS
and all sort of things.
He was becoming really powerful. Thank you very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have exhausted our list of main speakers. But I have to go back now to the first two speakers who came from Tanzania, simply because, as they say, charity begins at home. And here we're discussing really the constitution-making process in Tanzania and how all the other countries in the region and on the continent can help Tanzania achieve this process, deliver a proper constitution that will ensure that the country is governed much better than it is right now. So I go back to Professor Kitila Mkumbo. Are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Please give us, having listened to people from Uganda and Kenya and Zambia and Gambia, now what do you have to tell us about what you see as prospects for constitution-making processes being relaunched in Tanzania, and what are the prospects of that effort delivering fruit? Professor.
Thank you very much. I think having listened to various speakers from different countries, the conclusion is clear that different countries tend to have different experiences and maybe different drivers of new constitution. For example, if you go to Kenya, you find out that really what united people was their will and their drive to ensure that Moi leaves power. I think that was key in Kenya. Having listened to the last gentleman from Gambia, you see that removing Jamal from the power was also a key driver. I think that the main difference is from Zambia, which the driver has been the willingness and the readiness of the first president to give in power, to accept the defeat. And we should remember that many African leaders then actually blamed KK very much for having accepted the defeat. They thought that he should have hung on. And I think if we decided, he would have stayed in power, but I think he did a very good thing for the country. But also the experience we see, which I'm not sure if we have the experience in Tanzania, is that in the constitution change process, really, the civil society is key. And this is where I wanted to go back to my friend Fatma when he said that I don't trust the system. System is a political power. And we know the motive for all political powers in the world, be it in the US or in the UK. At the end of the day, political powers will be there. They want to form the government. That will be their main motive. So without the civil society playing a role, without the masses being rallied around, we may get the constitution, but what kind of the constitution? For example, here in Tanzania, one of the big issue is people think that, I mean, the elites that we are pushing for the new constitution is that our president is too presidential, or other people talked about the imperial presidents. But I have been reading the two drafts that we have. The draft constitution by the Warioba Commission and the constitution famous known the Sita version. But if you read these two versions, really, the presidential powers are still very presidential. They're still very imperial. So at the end of the day, what are we looking for? I mean, you will see some changes here and there. So that's the experience we have in Tanzania. I think that in Tanzania, the civil society has not played a very big role in terms of pushing for a meaningful constitution. We have left the constitution-making process in the hands of politicians. We saw in 2014, at the end of the day, it was Jakaya. Today, the drivers of this, it is my party, our president, and the opposition led by Mr. Moy. So at the end of the day, really, the contents of the constitution will end up being decided by the politicians. So this is key to understand the context of Tanzania. And lastly, having listened to all the speakers, it comes to my mind that we seem to be too much stuck with the presidential system. In Africa, we don't talk much about the parliamentary system because I think all the countries, they're struggling with the powers of the president. As we can see in Kenya, they have a nice constitution, but orders have been given by the court. Nobody's listening to them. They have moved as if nothing has happened. So maybe time has come in Africa to begin really talking about, do we necessarily have to have presidential system? Can we go back to our colonizers? Maybe think of the British system where we have the prime minister and then have somebody here, somebody who is ceremonial. We call him a head of state because our president here is the head of the state. He is the leader of the government. He's the commander-in-chief of our defense forces. These are huge powers. I mean, anybody who gives these powers, it really, I mean, it is bound to be very presidential, to be very powerful. So finally, for us, we are in the process. As I said at the beginning, our main change in this country came not very much like in Gambia or in Kenya. Changes in this country came mainly because we had on the day we had a leader who was willing to bring those changes. And lastly, I mean, the main difference from us, unlike Kenya, unlike maybe Gambia, unlike Uganda, is that system in this country has been clever in a way that it has been capable of changing leaders. So after every 10 years, we have a new president, and we tend to forget that, you know, so our problem seems to be somehow lesser after every 10 years. So we had President Magufuli for 5 years. He would have gone maybe for 10 years. Now we have a new president. And there is that, fresh air, a breath of fresh air in Tanzania. We have a new president. So yes, the party is the same, like Fatima is saying, but look here, we have a new president. Come 2030 again, 2030, we are going to have a new president again. So I think this has helped to see that actually system is not a problem. What is important here is really to keep on having a new president. I think this has helped our country somehow to remain as it is and not to have the kind of struggles that we see in other countries for pushing for the constitution. Mr. General, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kitila Mkumbo. And now inevitably, Fatma Karume, Advocate Karume.
Thank you, Generali. It's amazing how much CCM understands itself and the deceitful nature of its politics. You see, CCM always hides behind this mask of changing and having a new president every 10 years. And they think, well, why do Tanzanians need to change the party? We give you a new president every 10 years. It's going to be fine. We put a new face on every 10 years. Well, look, Professor, what is important is that the power has to go back to the people of this country. It is not for CCM to keep, and it's the people of this country who have to decide their social contract. The constitution we have today is a constitution that was drafted by CCM, imposed on the people of Tanzania. The constitution was amended to ensure that CCM remained in power. And we now need to return the power back to the people of Tanzania. CCM is a political party. It is not the people of Tanzania. And therefore, we have to make this process inclusive. We have to ask the people what type of social contract they want, and we have to respect them. Obviously, what I would like to see is, look, specialists advising. This cannot be hijacked by politicians. The process ought not to be hijacked by politicians, in particular, politicians who aim at the end of the constitutional process to remain in power, to be, for example, MPs, or have an interest to become president, because they will make sure they draft this constitution to suit themselves and not the people of the United Republic of Tanzania. So what I would like to see is a constituent assembly that is fully representative of the people of Tanzania. And if it needs to represent members of political parties, then those people have to be barred from entering politics for the next 10 to 15 years. You cannot be a member of the Constituent Assembly to draft a constitution so that your political party remains in power, or draft a constitution for yourself so you can become an all-powerful president. No, that we will not have. So this is my idea, that we should have, I hope that the president will proceed with this discussion, and that we have to have a constituent assembly that is fully representative of the people of the United Republic of Tanzania, and not a CCM party caucus that it was in 2014. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Advocate Karume. Now we have come to the end of our presentations by the main speakers, and the experiences are really edifying. We have all sorts of experiences that people have gone through. As I said earlier, it has not always been linear. It has been very eventful, sometimes very exciting, sometimes dramatic, and in other areas, even deadly in some of the engagements in the constitution-making processes. But all is well that ends well, and some examples have been shown that people can resist the most formidable forces, the most nefarious interventions by armed forces, police, security, and so on and so forth, like we saw in the Gambia. And yet the resilience of the people of the Gambia managed to overthrow a dictatorship and establish a constitutional order within which they can work and evolve. Now, I would like to open our discussion to the wider audience. We have people here, about 90 people, who have raised their hands, and I'll start by naming them. But I would like to ask them to be very brief, take 1.5 minutes each, so that we have as many people as possible speaking to us this afternoon. So I start with Israel Ilunde.
Okay, thank you very much, Moderator Generali. Quickly, I must go to Professor Kitila Mkumbo, my friend, who think that the civil society has not done much. I think we defended vigorously when they made the law. Are you hearing me?
Yes, yes.
When we defended against the bill in 2011, the constitutional making bill was worse. They talked about bringing in all the politicians, and we said that is wrong. We need a representation like what Fatuma has said. But I think that trial, we tried, and yet these people did not listen. And then you are saying we didn't do more. What could we do if the demonstrations are restricted and so forth? So my understanding is that we still have an opportunity to play from now, to prepare the ground for people to participate from villages to the level where they can push for a better constitution. And my understanding is that if we leave this again to politicians, we are going to move to the same, even worse drafts. I think we have a chance now to make sure we start, not waiting for the law to be made. We have to start now with the civic empowerment of our people. When the law is again amended, we have a better contribution from the people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Israel. Francis Kiwanga.
Thank you very much, Generali. I may have missed the initial part of this conversation. I joined a little bit late. So my question is to my two colleagues, Tanzanian colleagues, resource persons for this discussion today. In Tanzania, we know the process. We started with the Warioba, went to Sita's National Assembly, and here we are now in this process. So my question is, if we are to restart again, where should we start? Do we start with Warioba, where Warioba Commission ended? Or what is the best way to move forward with this process now? Also considering that not long ago, President has also set up a new commission, which has also done its work and submitted a report to the president. So if we are to advise whoever who is making decision about this process, what is the best starting point on this process?
Thank you, Francis. Pimbi Magoti.
Thank you, Generali. I'm sorry for that name, but I am Tito Magoti.
Who called you Pimbi? They gave me Pimbi Magoti here.
Well, no worries. But I want to echo what my brother Francis Kiwanga just said, because I'm afraid that with the current state of affairs in our country, where like how Professor Kitila confirmed that we have a super presidential kind of regime, we may end up getting an elite-driven kind of a document, which is why at the wake of this lack of consensus, it is pertinent for us democracy actors, rights defenders, and all sorts of people who are interested in this dialogue to raise these questions so that those in corridors of the power can hear, because we are expecting to have a constitutional reform committee, sort of, as the president pledged. But there are very important questions that we need to bring on board, especially trying to bring back the people at the center of this process, because the distractions of the past 6 years detached most of the people from the government, and we really need to have a people-centered kind of document that's going to live long and make an impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to request all those who want to speak, please, to raise their hands. Thank you very much, Tito. You are still in what, Newcastle or something?
No, now I'm in Birmingham.
Birmingham.
Yeah.
That's just another football team. Now we have Odero. Odier. Can you hear me? Odero?
Yes. Mr. General, how are you?
I'm very fine, thank you. You're welcome.
Yes, mine is not a question, it's a comment.
Okay.
Yes, the problem we are facing in Tanzania now is that we have a portion of land without people. So we have a country whereby there is not a single person who can defend even the law we have now. We have the constitution right now. And once you read the Article 8 of the Constitution, state well that the power belongs to the people. But where is the people within this country who can even defend the current constitution? Now in Tanzania, we are still depending. And we see something like the constitution is not our right, but it is the privilege from the Samia Suluhu Hassan, the president, and the Chama cha Mapinduzi. So all of us, we are still waiting for the privilege and not to understand that the new constitution, the demand, it is our demand, it is our right. So for me, we have to go to to go back to the board and to educate our people to know their right and to know that this is our country. And even the current constitution we have, there are some powers, there are some rights which we can use and exercise. But you see, we have failed even to defend the current constitution we have. We have seen several cases in the court. Government doesn't want to execute the court orders. You remember about the private candidate case. Even there are some many orders from the court. Government doesn't want to bother to implement. You remember about the case of Loliondo and Ngorongoro, what government did. So for me, the new constitution is not, for Tanzania, is like a privilege. So we don't, still now, we don't know what we want, because for us, many of us, we think, we talk like new constitution is a privilege and is not a right. So if we continue to act like this, it will take us 25, 30 years, even 50 years without the constitution what we want. Thank you.
Thank you, Ndugu Odero. You've made yourself very clear that we think that these things are just given to you as a gift by a well-meaning president or a well-meaning ruler and so on and so forth. Whereas really, these are your rights that you must fight for and defend. The next person will be Advocate Helen Kijo Bisimba. Helen.
Yes. Thank you, General. I'm sorry, I'm not advocate, please.
You're not advocate.
Helen Kijo Bisimba. No, I'm not an advocate anyway.
You're a magistrate.
I am Helen. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay,
yes,
okay, Helen.
My comment, I was listening. Thank you so much for making me an advocate. And I know when we talk about advocates, those are the advocates of the High Court. Maybe I'm people's advocate. Okay, yeah. Then I was just listening to this very, very good and powerful presentations from all our friends in Gambia, Zambia, Kenya, Uganda. And I got one statement which really impressed me, and I think it is going to answer the question of Odero when he is talking about where are the people. Advocate Tal from Gambia said that when the people knew it was enough, they managed to vote for change. And I think maybe Tanzanians have not gotten enough. I think JPM went too soon. If we had stayed more for more, maybe 2, 3, 5 more years, maybe we could have enough and the people would have woken up, and we should not be talking about expecting the political will of a president, the political will of the executive to come up with a people's driven constitution. So what I think is we tried when President Kikwete came up with the idea that we are going for to review the constitution. The civil society and even the political parties tried to make sure that people understand and the people know about why we need a new constitution. We did a lot of work in that area. But then after it was hijacked or it was stopped, people just kept quiet. And when the President JPM said he didn't want to talk about it, everybody just went mum. So I think we have not gotten to the point where we think it is enough. When it comes there, I'm sure it is going to happen. And I don't know when it is going to happen. Because if we are still waiting for the mercy and political will, I agree with Odero that we can stay for 50 years before we get this. So what we want to do is to think, what can we do to make sure that people who are the power can do something to change what is not going on as we want. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Now I'll move to an advocate, Harold Sungusia.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, General and the rest. And quickly, thank you very much for this very informative discussion. I have 2 questions, but I will start with a small preamble. Professor Kitila Asante, thank you for what you said. Is actually a password if we want to move forward. You said something which actually is still resounding in my ears, that the opposition or anybody else can decide or can define the agenda of constitution, but the ruling party decides the process and determines the process. For me, this is a PhD thesis, if you wish, that now, if that is the scenario, and you articulated it very well, that the ruling party determines the process, and hypothetically, any process will actually come to determine the end product. If you have a process, that normally the process and the materials, the process determines what the end product will be. Now, in this scenario of ours, in our constitutional making process now, I would love to hear from you. How do we create a balance between the serious conflict of interest, which will be tainting the ruling party in determining the process, towards having a content that is balanced and catering for the rights of everybody in the country, regardless of the political ideology? That's number one. How do we really alienate the conflict of interest in this scenario that Professor has just told us? And number two is also a question that is posed to anybody. We know most of the socialistic countries used to have supremacy of party as their overall national policy. I want to know whether there can be supremacy of constitution where you have supremacy of the party, and whether these two are compatible, because we have been laboring a lot in terms of defining the constitutional agenda in the environment where we are guided by supremacy of the party, and that has also been affecting even the process that ended installment from 2014 process that ended with the Katiba ya Warioba, Katiba ya Chenge. You remember what happened. It is because of the conflict of interest vis-a-vis
the issue of supremacy of the party guiding the interests of the ruling party. And now, how do we address this kind of conflicting polarities? Supremacy of the party versus the supremacy of constitution, which is an ideal situation which we want to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. And those questions will be asked by people who know. Fundikira Wazambi.
Yes, it's Wazambi, sir. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to contribute. And I would like to congratulate the speakers. They have articulated key issues very well. And based on Professor's advice on the way forward, I think as CSOs now, we need to show system how a new people-centered constitution can actually translate into votes. Because I believe we all stand to benefit, or if it is suffering, we are all going to suffer, including CCM. So for us, we can really show our CCM, since they are the ones holding the penny here, we need to show them how they are going to benefit from this people-centered constitution, and to make it very easy for them, since they want to remain in power. It is going to be better, because if the people are happy, if the rights are safeguarded, then people are not going to think about change of government. But if things continue like this, I do not see the situation remaining the same for long. So that's what I see as CSOs, what we need to do. We need to engage the ruling party and really try to show them how we are all going to benefit from this. Thank you.
Francis Kiwanga again.
Sorry, I don't mean to contribute now. I raised it earlier on. Thank you so much, General.
Okay. Any more contributions? Can you raise your hands? We have Vince Paulo. Vince Paulo or Vince Paulo.
Hello, hi guys. Thank you, General, and good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, you've been my idol. You're doing an excellent job in a very difficult environment. For a long time, I've been following you. So actually, I wanted to talk a little bit about the conflict of interest that obviously CCM has got. They, a lot of contributors mentioned this. And I think one of probably the answer to Sungusia's question would be to what Madam Karume was saying, which is to remove their participation and also remove all those who are either first order and second order beneficiaries of Takanda process from participating in it. So obviously, most of the people in the government, including CCM, should not participate in this to a larger extent, because obviously there's a serious conflict of interest that they wouldn't want to let go. That was my contribution. Thank you.
I did not get you quite clearly. Who do you not want to participate in the process?
So basically, because there's a serious conflict of interest from the CCM party as a political party, so you cannot let the same person who has got a conflict of interest to run the process or determine the outcome. So either themselves and you have to determine also which are called them a first order, so like people directly benefiting from it, and also secondary order. So like any other of their clique who would be benefiting, they should not have a direct contribution, or their contribution should be quite curtailed, minimized.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, next is Holmstrom. Anna Holmstrom.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. I was recently at the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg, and I was reading with great interest the exhibition on the role of the All Africa Conference of Churches in that struggle. And so I was really interested to hear more from the Kenya presenter, but she also mentioned that the architect was sitting next to her, that how practically was the faith community involved in the Kenya constitutional change process? What were the sort of structures that were engaged and how? And also recalling the fact that now the All Africa Conference of Churches is led by a Tanzanian Lutheran pastor, just as a small tidbit there. But just to hear more about how practically was that engagement and the experience. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I hope somebody can give you what they know about the involvement of the faith-based organizations and movements. We know, of course, they have been very active everywhere. They're very active even in Tanzania today. The various clerical organizations, faith-based organizations, churches, and other organizations which have been very active. Now, could we go back to the main presenters and see whether we can get some answers to some of the questions? Maybe not all the questions will get answers, but maybe there is a possibility of having some answers. For instance, where are the people? How are they organized? How do you access them? How do you sensitize them? How do you get them in your corner? How do you instill in them that courage, that self-abnegation sometimes of coming out, that makes them come out and take risks? Because sometimes it's not only wasting their time, wasting in quotation marks, but how do you get them mobilized, energized, and weaponized, as it were, to get into these processes and commit themselves fully, and have that resilience, that ability to stay on in spite of all the difficulties. How do you get the people to be aroused sufficiently to take action and to hold the governors accountable? Who's going to answer this? Kitila Mkumbo, I think. Kitila, I saw your name here. I thought you were ready to answer some of these questions.
Yes, I am. I was muted. I am.
Oh, okay.
Let me pick 2-3 questions. One from Francis Kiwanga, which they are somehow similar to Israel Lunde. So Francis Kiwanga asked a direct question: where should we start? And he wanted my advice. I mean, I think where we are, we have 2 drafts. One draft with somewhat a political legitimacy, and one draft with a legal legitimacy, but not so much political legitimacy. So I think where we are, we need to get some sort of a technical team to review the 2 drafts and come up with a balanced draft, and see if it is possible to come up with a balanced draft, which should go back to the Constitutional Assembly, which has to be reconstituted before it goes to the referendum. So that would be my advice in this regard. But I don't know our principals, what they're going to decide. No people to defend, like, I mean, in Tanzania, in my view, anytime you do an opinion poll research, one of the questions we ask about issues of political affiliation and issues of political trust, it has never gone below 60%. It has always been around 66 and above. They will be telling you they have trust with the CCM to form a government. It has always been like that since we started conducting opinion polls. And even the recent one that I'm aware of, I think is more than 70%. We don't know after the, the president allowed political parties to organize political rallies, maybe it's going to change. What does it mean, Mr. Israel Runde? It means that even within the civil society, I mean, CCM is too much present in our society. It is very much ubiquitous. I mean, too much available. So even within yourselves, system is there. I mean, so when President Kikwete appointed the civil society representative to the Constitutional Assembly, probably 6% of them were also on our side. That is the political reality of our country. So I'm not saying that one is bad or is good, but it is the reality. So, and Sungusi, I think, constitution making process is partly and largely really a political process. So to think that you are going to exclude politicians from this process, I mean, it is almost thinking the unthinkable. And how do we create the balance? The balance cannot be created from nowhere. At the moment, as we speak, the political apparatus in Tanzania is dominated by system. You talk about the bunge, the government. System is dominating. And that has been for the past, since we started multi-party elections in 1995. Which means that so long as this is a constitutional making process, which is part politically, because the reality in the society is that, it is not balanced. It is unlike in Kenya, where you have Ruto having almost 50 and Raila Odinga having 50. In this country, is not the case. In this country, the political pendulum is not balanced. It is not balanced. And therefore, at the end of the day, the process will not be balanced. So I agree with the advice of Azam, which I think is the right one. We have to engage system. We have to engage system so that in this process, engaged and we get a balanced constitution. But you cannot really take system out of this process. And therefore, answering where are the people? The people are there. These are the people that have been voting system since 1995. So they are there. And generally, unfortunately, if you go to the opinion report that we have, if you ask people to mention their challenges, unfortunately, Katiba does not form part of 10 major challenges that Tanzania think they need to be resolved, which was unlike in Kenya, where I was reading the opinion report way back in 2007, 2009 for Kenya, when I was trying to do some research on this one. Overwhelmingly, the majority of Kenyans placed Katiba at the very top of the agenda. It is not happening in Tanzania. I'm not saying it is not important. It is very important, but the reality is, from the normal Mwananchi in the street, if you ask them, they're mentioning other things. So so this process is going to remain with us, the elite, the politicians, and therefore engaging system, I think, is key in the process. Asante.
But Professor, could I ask you a subsidiary question?
Sure.
When you ask people on the street or in the villages about what their priorities are, and they don't mention Katiba, but they mention hunger, the lack of clean and safe water, they mention school fees, they mention whatever. Wouldn't you attribute that lack of anxiety about the Constitution to what they call false consciousness?
Yes, that is now interpreted.
They know what their problems are, but they cannot link those problems to the Constitution.
That is true. So that becomes a matter of interpretation, just like we did in 1992. 80% of our people said that they went for they wanted one party, but we interpreted and said, well,
but they
this
wanted
one
a Democratic Party. They
exactly. So even with this one, we'll have to interpret. We'll have to interpret, because also people don't like Constitution. They're giving them examples of Iraq. They're giving them examples of Libya. Look at Libya. They were very autocratic, and still they were being given honey. They were being given milk. They are not paying school fees. So, guys who don't like the constitution, they have all the excuses, which I say again, engagement remains key, engagement with the ruling party.
Thank you, Prof. Any other member of the panel who would like to respond to some of the questions?
Generally, I would like to say, yes, engagement is essential. Engagement of CCM is essential. It is essential that we engage the other parties as well, including Chadema and ACT Wazalendo. But I think what CCM has to realize is that it is not their process alone. CCM has to realize that this is not a process that needs to be hijacked by the elite. The elite have to accept that power comes from the people. And therefore, the elite, as the professor referred to his party and himself clearly, have to accept that if they do not, and this is something I think you have to be very careful with, Professor, if you do not take power back to the people, you risk the people taking it by force. We have seen this happening in a myriad of situations, and do not think for a minute that it cannot happen to Tanzania. You're back now, I think.
Yes, I'm back. Thank you. I'm back. I think kuna simu ilikuwa inaingia. I'm back, Fatuma. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Did you hear what I said, Professor?
No, I didn't. There was a stream coming in, so it didn't interrupt me. So if you can repeat, please.
Yeah, I was just saying, Professor, that, and then I'll have to attend another meeting. I've got another meeting in the next 2 minutes. Now, yeah. I'm pleased that I do agree with you that we do have to engage the political parties because they cause the most trouble, including CCM and Chadema and ACT Wazalendo and so on. However, I think you have to be very careful how you ought not to look at this as a process that belongs to the elite. Look, there are very few of you elite, but very many wananchi. And if you push the wananchi hard enough and you do not give them back their power, you cannot control them, Professor. There will come a time when they will take power back. We have seen this happening in dozens of countries. Look, you only need to look across the channel to Zanzibar. It happened in Zanzibar in 1964. So do not take this lightly. Do not think that the elite can control the masses forever. The reason why you give power back to the people is to ensure that your heads are kept on your necks as elite. Thank you.
But Fatma, you are having a case hearing ex parte. Anyway, let's continue. I have a number of messages here. The first one comes from Naomi Silayo, and it says it has been a very insightful session, learning from our brothers and sisters within the region. I wish to learn how best do we inform meaningful participation of different groups within our society, i.e. women, youth, and people with disabilities. What are the best practices within the region? And here I mean their involvement from the very beginning, e.g. composition of the committee, the Constituent Assembly, and the referendum. That's the question that Naomi Silayo is asking. Is anybody interested in answering that? Fatma, Kitila, Jill?
Generally, I'm going to have to leave. I have another meeting now. If you don't mind, I'm going to have to leave.
Hasta la vista, baby.
Thank you.
Okay. Who would like to answer that question? Jill, are you still with us? Jill?
Maybe I can try. I can begin.
Let's try the others. How about Advocate Tal? Tal, are you still with us or have you gone to the river? No? Okay, Kitila?
And maybe after 5-6 minutes, I will also ask for a leave, General. I need to.
Okay, okay. I'm winding up.
Okay, good. So I mean, I think the best option to get the best practice, I mean, or the best option for that matter is to, first of all, identify the main groups in the society, say as CSOs, women reps, people with disabilities, and ask them to elect or appoint their own representatives. Not like we did in 2014, that these people were picked by the president, I think. So ask the civil society organizations, give them the criteria that the people are looking for, and let them choose their own reps to come to the Constitutional Assembly instead of one person appointing them. I think that would be the best option, because if one person appoints them, even if he does in good faith, he will be accused of having favored members from his or her own political party, for that matter. So that would be my real proposal in this regard.
Okay. The other question comes from Rebecca Jumi. I think to get people, we need to go back to the basis of having an inclusive agenda. Many times the discussion around constitution will focus on issues of power sharing and structures, etc. And I don't mean they are not important, but to get people-centered process, a people-centered process, wananchi need to feel the agenda is as inclusive as possible. Otherwise, the process will be led by politicians as it is now, evidently. That is Rebecca Jumi. It does not need any answer, because what she's saying is that we should center everything that we do around the people. The people should be the focal point of everything that we do, and draft everything we want to draft, craft every mechanism, every structure, all parts of the architecture around what the real needs of our people are. And I think that is without any contestation. I do not see any other hands coming up. And I think we have come to the end of this segment of the meeting. Only I would like to now take a few minutes to have a reflection on what we have said up to now. And I have a few points to make. One thing that we agree upon is that the constitution-making process is a very important process for all our countries. That the constitution-making process in Tanzania in particular, because that's where we have anchored our concerns, is very important. And the fact that it was started in 2011, only to stall around 2014, is an unfortunate fact that has to be rectified. And the constitution-making process resurrected, reinvigorated, and re-energized to involve all the people concerned and make them build their own constitutional future together in peace. And we know that if people are not satisfied with what is happening around them, they may not express their displeasure, they may not express verbally their discontent, but they will not be happy, and their unhappiness will show in one way or another. That we need to revitalize all the vital energies in our society to demand that all sectors of society be involved in constitution making, that we approach these tasks with the generosity of spirit and love for our countries, so that we realize that there is no political organization, there is no political party that is more important than the people of this country or the country itself. That we need to galvanize all our energies to go back to the Warioba draft, go back to the proposed constitutional draft that was aborted because it did not go through all the processes, and look at all those areas where we had disagreements and find out if there is a way of ironing out the differences, of proposing new ways of tackling the problems that were insuperable in those days, but which could be handled today, and to consult with everybody who has the best interests of our country at heart, consult with other countries in the region and in Africa generally, or even in the whole world, to find out if there are ideas, examples, best practices from which we can learn and re-engage with each other in openness and in truthfulness around the major issues pertaining to constitution making, learning from the experiences of all our countries, as we have seen this afternoon, the lessons that were shared by the brothers and sisters from Uganda, Kenya, Zambia, and Gambia. Now, I do not know if there is anything of importance that I have left out in that brief summary.
I think well summarized.
Yeah, and if there's anything else that you think could be added, I'm sure the Secretariat will take it on board. Can I hear anybody say anything? Are we happy with what we have done, what we have said, what I have asked that be recorded?
Yes, yes, we are very happy.
Very happy.
Very happy.
Then may I take this opportunity then to thank you very much for having participated in this enlightening process this afternoon, and to wish you all the best. And I'm sure this is not the last time that we'll meet. We might have the occasion to come again. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Florence. Florence, are you still with us, or have you gone for your breakfast?
I'm still around. Thank you, Generali, for the excellent moderation, and to the panelists for their insightful remarks. It's quite inspiring, and I feel this conversation has really triggered a lot of thinking around next steps. How can we coordinate as civil society actors and partners to bring the conversation outside of this space and into the public? Who are the stakeholders that we should be building alliances with? And here I think platforms like the media would be critical in terms of galvanizing the needed public support and engagement. The political actors will always push the agenda, but I think to the extent that civil society really influences and builds that robust conversation and influences the issues, because someone already mentioned it has to be issues-based. So what are the issues that we are putting on the front? A lot of conversation came out around the executive powers, and I feel this is an opportunity to really also check, and foster the checks and balances that have been sort of a critical issue throughout this series of years and regime where there was a lot of repression. And I think also the issue around access to justice, I wanted to underscore that. We have seen that a number of frameworks in Tanzania have hindered the right to legal redress and protection. We've seen the amendment in number 3 of 2020, where public interest litigation claims were essentially restricted. So how do we use the constitutional reform process to also bring that conversation forward? And also just to underscore the issue of public participation. We've seen that the legal and policy-making process has oftentimes excluded civil society voices because of the fast-tracked nature that legal and policy proposals are sort of considered, right from the executive into parliament and so on and so forth. So how again can we provide more safeguards that will allow for sufficient and enabling processes for civil society to participate when it comes to the legal and policy making process? There are a number of things that I think that Tanzanian civil society have an opportunity to influence this agenda. And I'm happy that this conversation has started. I look forward to continuing a lot of these conversations and hopefully get more meaningful input into this entire process. I thank you all, and especially to our panelists from the region, from Dr. Jill from Kenya, Dr. BK rather from Uganda, Linda from Zambia, and our colleague Advocate Tal, who's left from Gambia. For those insightful reflections, I hope we can call on you to share more as we continue in this discussion. I thank you all, and also to our participants, and also to our co-hosts, the Legal and Human Rights Center. Thank you, Dr. Anna Henga, Fulgence Raymond, and all of you colleagues for partnering with us in this engagement. Looking forward to continuing. Thank you all. Over to you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Florence. I would like to thank you all for having spared this afternoon that has been very, very fruitful. And I go away from here with a lot of thoughts, a lot of suggestions that have been made. One of them, let me just, even if I don't want to reopen this discussion, Professor Kitila talked about something. Why do we tie ourselves around the neck with this idea of presidency? And the presidency inevitably becomes imperial because the president tends to have so many powers that you think that reducing those powers make him or her, less of a president. Why don't we look at the Westminster system of governance, where there is no boss of ministers, all the ministers in the cabinet are equal. There's only one of them who becomes prime minister, and that he's only called the prime minister because he is chosen by those who came to parliament with him. And he's really what they call in Latin, primus inter pares, first among equals. And he has to lead by consensus. Then you have a president who is a figurehead, like you have in India, Ethiopia, or the king in England. Those are things that, these are takeaways that we can talk about and discuss in our private clubs and lunch meetings. I would like to thank all of you and to wish you, for those who are living in this part of the world, not for you, Florence, because I cannot say good evening or good night, because we still have a whole day before you. But for all those who live in more civilized climes, that like myself, good evening and good night and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Generali.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Everyone, bye-bye.
Thank you.